Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Between the Tides podcast presented by Portage Learning. I'm Erin Duffy-Amicus, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Tim Colleget.
Well, hey everyone. So glad you could be with us today because we have a fantastic episode planned for you. As you might expect, we're all about learning, and today's podcast happens to be all about learning. Specifically, how do we learn? For example, what happens to our brain during the learning process? And just as important, how do motivation and persistence play a key role in our ability to learn?
And to help us explore brain matters today, we're joined by two experts, Dr. Diana Rice and Dr. Brittny Martinez. Dr. Rice is the academic dean of faculty at Portage Learning and has her PhD in social psychology from Syracuse University. And Dr. Martinez is a biology department chair and math professor at Portage Learning and has her PhD in neuroscience from Penn State University. And we thought that their expertise in such differing parts of the brain would facilitate an interesting discussion.
So again, thank you, Diana. Thank you, Brittany, for joining us today. We're excited to hear from both of you. Now, I know we have a lot to unpack in today's episode, so if you don't mind, how about we just jump right in with the million-dollar question? So, Diana, how do we learn?
That is a $1,000,000 question. So I'm gonna my experience in teaching and learning has been all across the board. But I would say that there are a couple of key elements to how we learn. And one of them starts with attention. So we don't always pay attention. There are all sorts of studies that show that we miss things that are really obvious and really in front of our faces. There's a famous study where they presented people with a videotape that they had to watch, and they were playing basketball, and they were told to count how many times the basketball was passed. And in the middle of it, a gorilla walked across, like a man in a gorilla suit walked across, and people repeatedly missed it, never saw the gorilla at all.
Wow.
So even things that we think should be grabbing our attention don't necessarily always do so. So I would say one of the key things is, are we paying attention? And how are we kind of focusing our attention?
And there's a lot of changes that happen in the brain when we're learning. So, um, whenever we learn something new, we have a kind of collection of neurons that are responsible for that kind of information. And so, contrary to what past theories were many years ago, that the brain was not able to be changed, we know now that the brain is what we call plastic. It undergoes plasticity. So, connections between the billions and billions of neurons in our brain change based on our experience and when we learn new things. And so when we repeat, when we practice, anything kind of that you learn, the more you practice it, the better you get at it, the better you know it, the better you understand it, because practice and retrieval, which we'll kind of probably be talking about soon, make those connections between neurons stronger in our brain. So the stronger those connections, the more efficient the communication between those neurons. And that's how we're able to kind of get better at understanding things and knowing things and learning concepts better with time.
Yeah, I would say the attention piece really connects to that because you have to get the information into the memory system, into the learning system, and the piece that becomes important is once we've paid attention to something and we're processing it, that's where we see the connections of the neurons like physically changing, so that our brain is physically changing when we learn.
Right. And there's kind of different stages of memory in terms of time. There's different types of memory in terms of content, but there's also different stages. So you kind of have short-term memory when you first like encounter something new. It's in your short-term memory, which lasts kind of from minutes to maybe hours. And then as you kind of rehearse that information or maybe even practice it, say someone tells you their phone number, right? You hear that and it's in your short-term memory for a little bit of time. If you start practicing it over and over again, that's going to move if you practice it enough, into your long-term memory. And long-term memory is going to last. That's where we're doing days, weeks, months, even up to years for long-term memory. And memories are kind of stored all throughout the brain. There's different regions that are kind of more important to memory. The major one is the hippocampus that really helps move information from short term to long term storage. And then, whenever you retrieve something, like when you go to take a test and you're asked a question that you studied that material for, the hippocampus helps bring that information out of that long term back into short term or working memory to help you remember that information. And there's kind of stages in terms of memory formation. So we go when we learn something new, we kind of go from this encoding stage where your brain starts to form this representation of that information. And then we move into storage, which is that movement from short term to long term. And that process of storage is actually a neural process in the brain. It's where your brain is going to solidify those connections between neurons and form more or less kind of a permanent representation memory um, of that information. And that process is called consolidation. It's an actual neural process that happens, changes that occur between neurons. And then there's that retrieval stage where, if you're learning something and you've learned it, it's been stored, and then you recall it later and you bring it back out of long term, that's that retrieval stage. And that's super important when you're a student, especially. I mean, we use it every single day for a lot of things that we're doing, but especially as a student, when you're taking courses, that's the whole process of studying, right? You encounter that information when you first start looking through module material, when you first start reading textbook information, watching lectures. And then when you go to study, you're pulling that information and kind of practicing it again. And then able to review that information. And the more you do it over and over again, the stronger that memory is going to get because of the connections between neurons in the brain.
So it sounds kind of like using our attention as sort of like a flashlight to focus on what we would like to learn is really helpful. So, along that like thought process, would you say that an average student can become an excellent student? Like, is there a possibility there with just kind of like motivation and persistence and kind of that focused attention?
I would say for sure. I have no question about that. I know sometimes people have a hard time transitioning from an old way that they studied, or like maybe how they learned in high school, to college level courses because there's different requirements. But to me, that's a skill, and skills can be learned. So thinking about things not as fixed, I'm never going to get this, or fixed, I'm not smart, that's totally the wrong way to think about learning. It is a skill that's changing your brain, and the more you practice the skill, the better you're able to do the skill.
I completely agree. I think that the more tools also that you have to be able to study and learn, and some things I think work better for some people than others. There's kind of, evidence-based practices for learning of strategies that we can use to help us learn and to know things better. Um, and then you kind of find your own groove, I think, sometimes with how certain strategies might work better for you than others, or connecting it back to something more personal might be easier with certain topics, whatever it might be. So I absolutely think with practice, with learning study tools, that anybody can really become great at learning and studying and knowing things better.
So with practice, now maybe I could be wrong about this, but it would seem that you would have to really want to become a great student to moving forward with that process. So how do you engage your students? How do you get them to want to become better students?
So I not at Portage, but at other places I've taught statistics. And that's a course that people don't normally want to engage with. So I feel like I, for 20 years, have tried to engage students in something they don't want to know. Um, so for me, my approach is to try and help people see the practicality. Because I'm in the psychology discipline, and so anytime I can kind of get people to see, oh, there is something in this for me, and also that it's not as scary as maybe they anticipated. I think with some courses that we have at Portage, people go into it with this mindset of this is going to be rough. This is going to be too hard. And I would say maybe switching that to I'm up for the challenge. Or, yes, this will be challenging, and I'm going to have to put in some of the tools that Dr. Martinez was talking about or alluding to, but recognizing that it's structured so that it's practical for me, it's useful for me, and I can do this.
I agree with Dr. Rice. I've had a very similar experience teaching statistics that, and I think, like Ashley said, pulling it back, a lot of times I think students think, when am I ever going to use this? Right? Like, I know I have to take this course, whatever it might be, but I don't know when I'm ever going to use this because this is my career goal and I'm not going to do this. Or this is what I want to do. This is not relevant to me. So, a lot of times when I'm teaching more difficult courses, in the past, I've kind of even on maybe a first day of class or something said, um, I try to contextualize it and say, even if you're going into this field or this field or this field, this is why this topic is important. For example, statistics, right? A lot of people get nervous taking statistics because it's math. Um, it can be scary if that's not really the field that you think you're going into. But then I'll try to contextualize and say, whether you're going into nursing, whether you're going into clinical training, whether you're going into clinical psychology, whether you're going into research, whatever it might be that you're going into, statistics are in everything that we're doing today. And what if you have a patient that comes to you and says, oh my gosh, I just saw this thing on social media and everybody is saying it's the cure for all of the things that I'm going through. You have to be able to analyze that, even if you're not doing statistical analysis on an everyday basis. You have to have an understanding of that to be able to help your patients evaluate that information and to be able to lead them in the right direction, right? You have to be able to discern that one day in your field. Again, kind of whatever it might be. So even though it's scary now, even though you might think, I'm not sure why I really want to do this, I know I have to because it's a requirement. I try to motivate them and contextualize it and say, this is going to be important for you to know later on. And it's going to be important for you to be able to use those tools and have them at your disposal there. So I think trying to put it into a perspective of why this is important for their future career, for their future goals, um, can sometimes help them uh, be motivated to learn that material a little bit more.
Yeah, and, how would you recommend so I know you both mentioned that you try to put it in perspective for your students as to how important this will be for them as professionals, but when a student goes home and they don't have you in the room to kind of remind them of that important piece, do you have any recommendations or ideas of how students can get themselves interested in a subject that maybe is just not necessarily something they enjoy, and want to approach on their own time? Because those we know those practices and that repetition is so important for learning.
I have a couple of ideas. The first thing I would say is I think sometimes people disengage and think, I'm disengaging because it's hard, or I'm not motivated because it's hard. But what we know is there's a whole lot of literature in psychology about what's called desirable difficulties.
Mm.
And the idea with desirable difficulties is it's supposed to be hard. That's what learning is. So, like, not getting freaked out by this is hard. I'm having a hard time with this. I'm no good at this, or I'm going to not study this because it's too rough. That's actually the opposite of what's true. Like, so being able to address that and say, first off, I know that this is going to be hard. Dr. Martinez isn't in the room. Dr. Martinez isn't writing me an email right at this moment, but I can work through this because it's supposed to be hard. So not to the, not to the level that you're completely mystified and nothing makes sense, but putting in the work of learning, putting in the work of practice is supposed to be a task, and it can sometimes be a hard task, and we don't need to shy away from that. I'm
Also, a little bit of stress is good for you. It doesn't feel good in the moment, but it does help. It's been shown that a little bit, if something is a little bit as hard and stressful, and um, it takes a little bit more effort to do so, stress has been shown to, as long as it's not too much or too little, it helps improve our cognitive performance. It helps us increase concentration and focus. So when things, are a little hard, take a little bit more effort, might be causing us a little bit of stress to be able to do that. Again, it doesn't always feel good, but that little bit of motivation gives, and that little bit of stress, again, kind of a medium level of stress is actually good for us. It helps to increase performance, helps to increase concentration. Um, and so again, I think helping realize where your ultimate goal is, where you want your career to go, and keeping that in mind, maybe even if it's having daily affirmations or little post-it notes to remind you of, okay, yeah, I know this is hard right now, but this is where I need to be, right? And this is where I want to get to. And to get there, I have to take these steps to be able to achieve that. So I think it's hard to look ahead sometimes, but just taking it one step at a time, and keep moving forward, I think is a good way to look at it as well.
I was just gonna say, this is not really a positive one, but sometimes I am very motivated by people telling me I can't do something, and so that is why I have a PhD, because someone told me I couldn't, and now I do. So that can sometimes be a motivator too.
Yes. Yeah.
So I wanted to touch on something. You both mentioned that memorization is foundational to the learning process. But at what point does memorization morph into application?
hmm Yeah, so there is a term for that in psychology, and it's called elaboration. So that would be the way that we would talk about that. And that's about making the connections. Um, Dr. Martinez talked about that in terms of the neural connections, but then when we're making connections to something we already know, it strengthens the memory and then allows us to apply it in a new context. So you have to have the information in there to be able to recognize, oh, this is another example of this. Oh, this is another way I could use this information and apply it. And that process comes through elaboration, like making yourself think of the connections. Sometimes I am a little concerned that when I know how students study, um, that they're just kind of going through it by rote or just doing that memorization piece and not pausing to think. And that's kind of what I'm alluding to with the desirable difficulties as well. You have to pause and think and physically make yourself think of, how does this connect to something I already know, to get to that next step.
Right. Right. Memorization is that really important first step to know, kind of at a basic level, the concept, right? I know what the definition of this concept is. I know I can tell you what the definition is, or how that uh, equation works, or things like that. But then being able to apply that material is what's really going to help you in that next stage of your life, right? Like that's where you will be on a job one day, and you're going to need to take those definitions, those concepts, those equations, whatever it is, and actually use them in real life. And um, that's where you're demonstrating mastery of content, right? That's where you're showing how you actually understand that concept. And I think actually one of the best ways I've known how to apply material is when I teach it. I was a student for many, many years. And then when I started teaching, that was actually when I had to, I think, apply these things, come up with examples, real life examples of where my students would encounter these things. And so sometimes when students ask me what's a good way to study this, or how do I know when I know it, right? How do I know I'm prepared? And sometimes I'll tell them, if you can explain this to someone else, if you can teach this concept to someone else, your best friend, your parent, your sibling, then you can demonstrate that you know how to apply this material and that you can explain it in your own words, right? That's where you're really moving from that memorization to maybe not even knowing what that means. You just know the definition, but you don't really know what it means. And then putting it into more real life situations and contexts that you're able to problem solve with that information as well, right? Like, I understand how the body works, but what happens in a disease state? We talk about this a lot in biology classes, right? What happens when something goes wrong? And so I know how everything works when it's going right, but what happens when something goes wrong? And then you have to kind of use what you've learned to figure out what's going wrong, how do we fix it, what's the best practice there. So that's just an example, but I think memorization is that first really important process, and then moving on to applying that. And that's kind of something we learn our whole lives, right? Yeah. I have two young kids, and learning how to read, a lot of it is memorization at first, and then being able to put it in, read a whole sentence, right? Applying those rules for grammar and phonics together. They memorize those rules and then have to apply it. So this is like something we deal with our whole lives of learning, throughout being a student, throughout being in the workforce, whatever it is. We're always kind of using these tools as we're learning.
So you both mentioned over time how the field and research has shown that they used to believe the brain was a fixed thing and that students maybe couldn't, or different types of people may not have been able to learn different things. But now, with more research, we've learned that kind of anyone can learn anything if they put in the time and effort. And so, um, I know that idea is tied to something called growth mindset. So I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little about growth mindset and how you would give advice to teachers or coaches to deliver feedback to their learners.
Yeah, that's a good application in terms of what do we do with this? So the idea of growth mindset, and you can jump in, Brittany. The idea of growth mindset is just that because we know the brain is plastic, because we know that we are physically changing our brains, we aren't fixed. That's the opposite idea, fixed mindset, where this is all there is. This is the total. And so what I try and encourage students to think through is, no, there, if you put in the effort, if you put in the work, there is more that you can accomplish. There is more that you can do. And so kind of oriented towards, this is a challenge, not this is something that I'll never figure out. And there are all sorts of studies that kind of talk about, like, just even that switch of challenge, rather than obstacle, or opportunity rather than threat, like, actually allows us to think of possibilities that we weren't even considering before.
And I think that really helps because it makes that growth mindset makes us adaptable to many situations, right? Rather than saying, like, this is how I know how to do something, or this is how I know it to be true. I'm just going to keep doing it this way, or keep doing my own thing. Being open to learning new ways or having new tools or problem solving in a different way really helps us be adaptable to new situations. And when we're put into new situations, we can adapt better. We can learn, be open to learning new ways of doing things. Or even in the field of science, it's an important concept that data changes, findings change with time. And the more studies that we do, we learn new things about all different types of topics. So we have to be also willing to accept that um, things change and our knowledge changes over time. And I think that's a really important concept in things like science and psychology and many different fields, that we have to be open to that open to adjusting our viewpoints based on changing study information, things like that. Um, and I also think I tell students a lot that, I'm still learning things now. I think a lot of times students might think that instructors, professors kind of know everything. And I tell my students, if I don't know something, I look it up and I figure it out, right? Like we're learning new things every single day. And so it's okay to not know things, and it's okay to ask questions, and it's okay to grow your information and really have growth in your education on topics and things. And it's okay to struggle with topics, and it's okay to that things are difficult and won't click as easily as it has. I've drawn out an action potential thousands and thousands and thousands of times, and I know it start to finish memorization. But there's even in the last few years, I'll be drawing it out and something will click for the first time of why it actually makes sense to me. Even now that I've done it thousands and thousands of times, I'll be like, oh, yeah, I guess that does make sense. Even though, I know it and I know how it works, but something will click for the first time of, oh, yeah, I guess, yeah. I now know how to explain it even better, I think, sometimes now. So I think just having that growth mindset is super important in the learning process, and being open to change and being able to be adaptable in different situations is really important.
I wanted to jump back on something that you asked, Erin, about like how does this apply to feedback? Because I think I would hope that the kind of feedback that faculty are giving students is something about almost like we're in this together, and here's how we can like here's how you can make progress, and here's how you're missing this kind of question, so here's what I would suggest. But if someone's a student not getting that type of feedback, what do they do? How do they handle that? And then that I think becomes an issue where a student has to be open and adaptable, as Brittany's talking about, um, but also not afraid of that feedback. So, like getting negative feedback, getting feedback that you misunderstood something badly feels horrible. Like it does not a fun experience. But the change that growth mindset allows us to do is to say, this is one piece of information. How do I adapt and adjust from here? Whereas when we get negative or failure based information in a fixed mindset, this is over. I'm done. I'm never going to get this. But growth mindset allows that to be one piece of information that tells me I didn't understand this piece. How can I retool? How can I adjust to make it work?
So basically, you're saying that I can't do this yet, but I'm willing to practice until I can. Growth mindset. That's great. Now, if I could piggyback on that, there's a line I read earlier this week, and it sort of stopped me in my tracks. And I was hoping that the two of you could flesh it out. And I want to read it to make sure I get it correct. And it said, we can choose to use our time in class to teach students as much as possible, or we may use it to help them learn as much as possible. Can you speak to that?
So I have been a professor for over 20 years. I'm old now. And when I first started teaching, I was convinced my job was to pack information into people's brains. So I would like, okay, we've got 15 chapters, 15 weeks, a chapter a week. Let's get to it. And somewhere along the way, I experienced a shift in that approach towards more of the second. And so I work at doing a lot more discovery based learning and problem solving, because if you have the tools, some of the tools that Dr. Martinez was talking about, if you have the tools, then you can apply those in new contexts and know how to learn and how to approach a new topic area rather than just seeing it as disconnected bits of information, right? Like Google exists for a reason. You can look up facts. But what my job is as a professor is to teach you how to learn, how to use those, how to have wisdom about how to use those. And that's not Google. That's not
Yeah.
ChatGPT.
Right. Exactly. I agree. I also think, like Dr. Rice was saying, teaching students how to evaluate information is an extremely important skill to have, to know where the information is coming from, whether it's reliable, reputable, because as we were talking about, education has in the last few decades changed quite a bit because of Google and because all this information is now available to us, right? We can look up pretty much anything and it's there at our fingertips. But being able to actually have the tools to sift through that information and to be able to scaffold the information and kind of build it up and learn is incredibly important skills now that we have. And kind of going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, making it intentional and putting attention towards certain topics, and using time in the classroom to really focus on things that um, we as instructors or we as professors can elaborate on and help with the learning process, right? Um, and give our experiences as well. When I was in graduate school, one of the big things I learned was I would get individual lectures on certain topics. They would be related, but they were individual topics and individual lectures. For example, learning everything that the hypothalamus does, which is a ton of things. But I'd have a lecture on this topic, a lecture on this topic, a lecture on this topic. And by the end of the year, I had to know all of it. So what I did was one of the study tools I kind of used was I made diagrams and I put all of the lectures together in one diagram and tried to put everything together on the hypothalamus, on all its functions, and tie it all together so that it was one big picture. Even though I learned it in chunks, I tried to put it all together into one big picture. So I think that a lot of times in the classroom, we can be really intentional about looking at things in the bigger picture as well. And then saying, yes, you probably are going to need to memorize many of these things, but let me tell you why this is important altogether. Let me give you the big picture of how this works. Um, and giving them those tools to put that information together and how to tie it all back. And again, looking at it with attentional resources and giving it that motivation and engagement, I think is super important as well.
Yeah, I used to have a professor who would talk about how if we don't give our students the tools to organize the information, that a lot of our information will go into our head and we can kind of think of it as like a junk drawer so that when you try to retrieve it, it's like you can't find, you need something from there, but you can't find and locate that one item. So is that like a good kind of metaphor or simile to the idea of, like, listening to lectures and helping you organize, like, your what you may have memorized or what you're studying.
Yeah, I think having that structure ahead of time is essential. So like in portage classes where, you're working through a module maybe and like going ahead before you take notes, before you listen to a lecture, before you read anything and just being familiar with, hey, these are the big picture headers, these are the topics. This is going to provide me the structure. Um and I usually suggest, but this is like takes effort, so I don't think students do it. But like making a question about that, like, what do I want to know by the time I get to this module? Here are the big picture topics. What am I expecting? What am I going to know? And then listening to the lecture, reading the materials with that in mind, because that's also going to drive up attention because you're looking for answers ahead of time.
Mhm.
And it's giving you the structure of where to put all of these pieces. It's not just facts about the hippocampus. It's here's how it relates to everything.
Right, right. And at Portage, many of our courses have outcomes that we have for our courses, and they're really helpful to kind of highlight, okay, when you're done this course, this is what
Mhm.
you're gonna need to know, right? Like this is what we want you to know by the end of the course. And so I encourage students to use those outcomes as kind of a not so much a study guide, but as a kind of goal, right?
Mhm.
Like by the time I'm done this course, this is the big picture of what I'm supposed to know from that. And that's a really good guiding tool, I think, for studying and learning as well and knowing what to focus on.
So we're sort of up against it with our time for today. So is there anything that we addressed during our conversation that you would like to reinforce to our audience?
Um, I think my takeaway that I would want students to know, or people who are listening to this to know, would be that don't be afraid of effort and don't be afraid of feedback that you're not getting it, because that is teaching you what you still need to do. And like moving to that direction and thinking about things, I think provides the motivation and provides like some of the or minimizes some of the fears people have about learning and especially approaching difficult topics.
I would also say to trust the process, right? This is how our brains work is by practicing information and by, as Dr. Rice talked about, elaboration, kind of connecting different ideas together that solidifies information in our brain. And the more you practice it, the stronger those connections get, just like riding a bike or learning how to play an instrument or playing a sport. Learning conceptual information, it works the same in our brain. So that is how we learn. And I think putting forth that effort, it will be worth it, though it can be hard, though it can be very challenging at times, especially with more difficult concepts. In the end, your brain will be able to form those connections, and you'll probably see that light bulb moment happen and not even realize kind of how you got there. And then all of a sudden, it will happen. I see it a lot of times in the classroom with students where the light bulb finally goes off. And that's from practice. And that's from retrieval. And that's from all of these different tools that we're talking about with learning and putting real effort towards it and being motivated to learn that information.
Well, Brittany and Diana, today's discussion has been fascinating. We thank you so much. We really appreciate your time, and we will plan to leave here with a growth mindset, and we'll move on from there. So, thank you again. We really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It's been fun.
Yeah.